Welcome to part 3 of adverse events, investigational new drug and investigational device exception reporting. My name is Liz Ness, and I'm the director of the Office of Education and Compliance for the Center for Cancer Research. In part 3, I'll be talking about adverse events that require expedited reporting to the sponsor and then to the FDA under the IND or IDE regulations, including timeliness of reporting and the responsibilities of the investigator and the sponsor. Events to be reported in an expedited manner to various regulatory groups should be defined in the protocol, include the timelines for reporting, and indicate the appropriate form or database to be used. As you can see on the slide here, these are the applicable regulations and guidances related to IND and IDE AE reporting. So let's jump into AE reporting under the IND application regulations. Per the FDA, the PI must immediately report to the sponsor any serious adverse event, whether or not considered related to the investigational product, including those listed in the protocol or investigator brochure, and must include an assessment of whether there is a reasonable possibility that the investigational product caused the event. Sponsors will typically have an SAE form or a database that you need to use to report the SAE, or some sponsors may require you to use the FDA mandatory MedWatch form 3500A. Also, many sponsors, the concept of immediately reporting that's stated in the regulations, most sponsors allow for a 24-hour reporting, which is acceptable with the FDA. But be aware that not all SAEs may need to be reported to the sponsor in an expedited manner. Refer to your protocol for exceptions to expedited reporting. Sponsors may also require events to be reported, such as all pregnancies, regardless of the outcome, overdose of any drug while on protocol, or development of a previously undiagnosed cancer, for example. They may have separate forms, or the sponsor may want you to use the same SAE form or SAE process. So please be aware of that as well. Some studies have additional events that will need to be reported in an expedited manner to the sponsor, ultimately then potentially to the FDA, that are not SAEs, but may have a scientific or medical concern with the development of the product. These may be referred to as adverse events of special interest, or AESIs. These are non-serious that might be a precursor of a more serious medical condition, or important because they may have an impact on quality of life. For example, a protocol may require that all bleeding events greater than a grade 1 or even grade 1 be considered an AESI. So please be aware of that. Also should be stated in your protocol. Though the expedited report forms or databases may be different from sponsor to sponsor, they all have similar key components. There's reporter information, patient or participant demographic information, information about the investigational product or the study agent, including the dates given, the dose, the route of administration, possibly even the lot number, especially with something like a vaccine product, and an event description, including the severity and the type of seriousness and the attribution, as well as a narrative summary. One of the most important parts of the report, in my opinion, is the narrative summary. The recipient of these SAE reports very likely does not know anything about the participant and their history. The narrative helps to provide that background information necessary to assess the event and support the investigator's attribution of the event. So the narrative should include information that helps to describe the event, information that puts the event into perspective. So that could be including important relative participant history, such as underlying medical conditions, prior surgeries or other procedures, potentially family history, recent events that may contribute, be a contributing factor, concomitant medications, for example. It also may be helpful or even requested by the sponsor to provide supporting documentation. This could include an inpatient hospitalization discharge summary or a lab or imaging results. This can then just be referred to in the narrative summary, such as see inpatient hospitalization discharge summary for more information, and not include that in the narrative. So if you consider the following scenario, which does happen frequently, you have a member of the research team receives a phone message from the participant or a family member stating that the participant was hospitalized and no additional information was given. You know that because hospitalization is deemed serious, so there was an AE, an event that occurred that resulted in a hospitalization, most likely this is going to need to be reported to your sponsor in an expedited manner. So within that immediate or 24-hour time frame. So what do you do with limited information that you received in a voice message? So it's helpful if your research team is not the primary treating physician or even the primary institution for your research participant, contact them. Maybe the patient is coming to your research site, but they have a local physician and participant contacted that local physician and they told them to go to the hospital. So that local physician may know more about what the event is. Or you may be able to contact or even double check your own institution to make sure that they weren't hospitalized there. And submit what you have. Include in your narrative summary, what was the most recent clinical evaluation? What was the date? How were they doing? Maybe you haven't yet done an initial, visit. Include what you have at baseline, what you have with their history. Provide, a summary of what you do know and include a plan for completing and getting the rest of that information. And as you will see, the sponsor has timeframes for reporting to the FDA, which is why SAEs are reported in, within 24 hours. So it's going to be important for the sponsor to get as much follow-up information as soon as it becomes available. And that's typically done then with an additional or an amended SAE report. So as a general rule, follow-up is required. Or a follow-up report is required to be submitted to the sponsor when there is a change in the severity, attribution, or maybe the actual event itself. Maybe there was a symptom that the participant was admitted to the hospital with that actually then turned into an actual diagnosis. And that diagnosis then is the more appropriate AE term. If you have a change in the, or any new information, let's say about a death that becomes available. So you have a death, you have an initial potential cause of death, but an autopsy is going to be done. So you would want to then, after you receive that autopsy report, make sure that you do a follow-up if that cause of death then is different. And obviously, if you get requested by a, any regulatory or oversight group, this could be the sponsor, this could be even an IRB, you'd want to give them additional information. But as a general rule, follow-up isn't required, or a follow-up report is not specifically required if you're just letting the sponsor know the AE has resolved. But again, that can be very sponsor dependent. But the routine adverse event case report form would certainly have that end date for that adverse event. But be aware of that and follow what your sponsor requirements are. So now we'll focus on what the IND sponsors responsibility is for reporting to the FDA. And this could include your biopharmaceutical industry sponsors, but it could also include an investigator who holds an investigator-held IND. So the IND sponsor must report any suspected adverse reaction or adverse reaction to the studied treatment that is both serious and unexpected. So you can see why it's important to first understand the definitions associated with adverse events as was presented in part 1. You know what the suspected adverse reaction is, as well as what the definition for serious and unexpected is. There are potentially 3 types of reports a sponsor will be sent to the FDA: a 7-day report, a 15-day report, and a follow-up report. So let's take a look at those individually. The first is a 15-day IND Safety Report, sometimes referred to as an ISR. The sponsor must notify the FDA and all participating investigators of any IND from a clinical trial or other sources as soon as possible, but no later than 15 calendar days after the sponsor determines that the information qualifies for reporting. This would include all serious and unexpected suspected adverse reactions, also referred to as a SAR. We have talked about this. Again, these definitions are extremely important to understand. It also includes findings from other studies, findings from animal or in vitro testing, or an increased rate of occurrence of serious suspected adverse reactions. The sponsor must report any suspected adverse reaction that is both serious and unexpected if there is evidence to suggest that causal relationship between the investigational product and the adverse event. As mentioned in part 1 of adverse events, this can include a single occurrence of an adverse event that's uncommon but known to be strongly associated with drug exposure. This could be some type of hepatic injury or angioedema. One or more occurrences of an event that is not commonly associated with the product, but is otherwise uncommon in the population exposed to the drug, such as, say, a tendon rupture, or an aggregate analysis of specific events observed in a clinical trial, such as known consequences of underlying disease or condition under investigation, or other events that commonly occur in the study population independent of drug therapy, that indicates those events occur more frequently in the drug treatment group than in the concurrent or historical control group. So this could be even something as related to death due to progressive disease. The FDA considers SARs as unanticipated problems and reportable by the investigator to the IRB, which I'll discuss further in part 4. The sponsor must report, as I had mentioned, any findings from other studies. And this typically is epidemiologic studies or a pooled analysis from multiple studies or clinical studies, whether or not they were conducted under an IND. Sometimes INDs continue even after a product has been initially approved. And the sponsor considers that there could be a suggestion of significant risks to humans exposed to the product. Ordinarily, these findings would be reported in safety-related changes to the protocol, but sometimes issuing that IND safety report is a quicker way to get that information out, followed then by an update to the protocol, consent, or investigator brochure. I also mentioned that the sponsor must report any findings from animal or in vitro testing, whether or not conducted by the sponsor themselves or others that suggest significant risk in human exposure to the drug, such as teratogenic or carcinogenic effects. We have to remember that especially in phase 1 and sometimes even early phase 2 studies, animal studies and in vitro testing may still be ongoing to help assess for these types of toxicities in animals that could then impact humans. And then finally, the last example outlined in an IND safety report is that the sponsor must report any clinically important increases in the rate of serious adverse reaction over what is listed in the protocol or in the investigator brochure. There's also a 7-day IND safety report. The sponsor must also notify the FDA of any unexpected, fatal, or life-threatening suspected adverse reaction as soon as possible, but no later than 7 calendar days following the sponsor's initial receipt of information. And this is why your research team reports to the sponsor within 24 hours. The sponsor needs to make that initial assessment upon the receipt of an SAE report if this potentially could meet the requirement of a 7-day report to the FDA. The sponsor also needs to promptly investigate, obviously, all of the safety information it receives. They may need to ask, as I mentioned, for additional information from the submitter of the SAE report or from the research site. Any relevant or additional information that the sponsor does obtain that pertains to a previously submitted IND safety report does need to be submitted to them, to the FDA, as a follow-up to that IND safety report. And it should be submitted without any delay, but no later than 15 calendar days after the sponsor receives any of this new information. So for safety reports involving clinical trials in the US, the FDA typically would like the sponsor to submit a mandatory MedWatch form, which is the FDA Form 3500A. Sometimes a narrative might be more applicable, especially when the IND safety report is in reference to overall findings or pooled analyses, or from in vitro animal studies, epidemiologic studies, etc. Also, the Council for International Organizations and Medical Sciences, or CIOMS, one form can be used for foreign suspected adverse reactions instead of the FDA form. And so sometimes the PIs will see a CIOMS form versus a MedWatch form come through from a sponsor as an IND safety report. But in an IND safety report, regardless of what format, the sponsor must identify all previous IND safety reports submitted that concern a similar suspected adverse reaction and must analyze the significance of the suspected adverse reaction in light of the previously submitted or similar reports. This does need to be obviously then be communicated to the PI. So what happens when the PI gets an IND safety report? How is that handled? So an investigator will receive a safety report. The investigator should review the report and assess whether it identifies that the adverse event is unexpected, related, or possibly related to participation in research, and serious or otherwise puts or suggests that the research places the subject at greater risk of harm than was previously known. Unfortunately, there are a lot of IND safety reports that are sent to the PI, who then communicates them to the research team, that don't really impact an immediate protocol or change needed to a protocol. So not all IND safety reports are what I would consider to be true SUSARs, but the sponsor feels they want that information communicated nonetheless. So the PI does need to review and make sure that they understand if the protocol will be amended or the consent will need to be amended. They will need to, make those amendments. They do need to inform the research team and let the team know if the amendment is going to be needed. Refer to the IRB policy of if it is a true SUSAR, how is that then reported to the IRB? And then finally, informing participants and documenting their willingness to continue on the study. It also could even impact enrollment. Maybe enrollment will need to be halted. So we do need to, as part of continuing, informed consent, make sure that our participants are aware of that even before there may be a new consent document that the participant is required to sign. And that would all be related to the nature of the IND safety report itself. So a few reminders: expedited reporting of an adverse event for FDA regulated research is very much driven by the regulations, the timeframes, and what. So it's important to keep that in mind. These are a subset of all adverse events. All of the information captured about the expedited event must be present in the source document and be found in an adverse event case report form. So all of the SAE information, grade, attribution, term should be in the regular routine adverse event case report form. And remember that some events that initially appear to meet expedited reporting requirements may actually be excluded from expedited reporting per the protocol. So remember to check your protocol to make sure if you have exceptions to expedited reporting, because the protocol will trump the regulations in terms of the 24-hour reporting of an SAE to the sponsor. All expedited report forms and responses do need to be placed in the regulatory files. Again, I had already mentioned the investigator-sponsored studies that must follow both the investigator reporting requirements as well as the sponsor reporting requirements. So I did want to just, I talked about FDA and INDs, but some of you may be wondering about devices. The reporting requirements for the investigator and sponsor for events under the investigational device exemption regulations includes reporting to the sponsor or the FDA and to the IRB as well. An investigator needs to submit to the IDE sponsor and to the reviewing IRB or the IRB of record of any unanticipated adverse device effect occurring during the investigation, as soon as possible, but no later than 10 working days after the investigator learns about the effect. So again, refer to the sponsor as well as to the IRB in terms of the submission formats. And then the sponsor who's conducting the evaluation of the unanticipated adverse device effect will report the results of their evaluation to the FDA and to all of the reviewing IRBs and participating investigators within 10 working days after the sponsor first receives notice of the device effect. The submission should include a cover letter summarizing the sponsor's analysis of the event and the FDA's mandatory MedWatch form, that 3500A. The sponsor should submit additional reports, obviously, concerning the effect as appropriate or as requested by the FDA. So in summary, adverse event reporting involves both routine and expedited reporting by the PI and research team to the sponsor and the sponsor to the FDA. It's important to know your sponsor's expedited AE reporting requirements, including the timeliness, the format. Remember, the narrative summary is extremely important. And also be aware of any exclusions to expedited reporting to the sponsor. So let's do a knowledge check here. Per the FDA regulations, and I'll say the IND regulations, an investigator is to report an SAE to the sponsor, fill in the blank, immediately, 24 hours, within 7 days, or at the next monitoring visit. And the correct answer is immediately. The sponsor, the regulations say immediately, the sponsor may say that's 24 hours. So do refer to your protocol. So thank you for listening to part 3 of adverse events.